Welcome to our long-awaited webinar called People's Choice, Seed Questions Across Canada. Thank you very much for being here. It's a busy time, as always. Every time seems to be a busy time, and your presence on the webinar means a lot to us. My name is Steph Hughes, and I'm the Regional Coordinator in Atlantic Canada for the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security. This program's goal is to increase the quality, quantity, and diversity of seed grown ecologically and organically across Canada, as many of you will know. And over the course of the last 2 years, we've hosted a number of webinars on many aspects of seed production and conservation, as well as our Canadian seed culture. We've had the opportunity to speak to hundreds of you across the country via these webinars, and we've received a lot of really great questions and ideas from you in that time. So today's webinar was kind of designed to honor your participation and engagement with this series. So we've designed it specifically around the topics and questions that you guys have been asking us about. I want to thank you for taking us up on this idea. I was really surprised by how many submissions we got. We received dozens of submitted questions and ideas and topics. And we've done our best to kind of group them and prioritize them and then engage people who would be really excited to speak to those topics. So I'm excited to get started. We'll just do a couple of quick announcements before we jump in. All of our webinars and our partners' webinars are recorded and available online. So you can access quite a number, like hours and hours of high-quality seed education by visiting our website, seedsecurity.ca. Those links are on your screen now. And this webinar will be added to that list very soon. If you're having any trouble hearing us, you may want to adjust your speakers. You can do that both with the speaker volume icon at the top of your screen, or you can do it through your computer and speaker settings at home. If you're having technical trouble with the audio through your computer, you do have the option of dialing into our phone line to get the audio. The number and code are on the screen now, and they're also typed into the chat pod at the bottom right corner of your screen. So if you do call in, and you're welcome to do that, just remember to mute your line by pressing *6, and that helps us avoid any disturbance or static or whatever on the phone line during the presentations. So we have a terrific webinar lined up today. Based on a survey we did in January, February of this year, we'll be featuring a presentation on-farm selection, roguing, and adaptation by Dan Brisebois. This topic was ranked most wanted among those of you who participated in the survey, so we're really glad to squeak it in at the end of 2015. And then following that presentation, we'll have a brief Q&A with Dan, and then we'll move on to our seed panel Q&A. So panelists are going to start with questions that you all submitted in advance, and we'll preserve some time at the end of the webinar for live questions, so feel free to jot them into the chat pod as we go, or make a note until the time comes. To ask a question, that's what you do. You type it into the chat pod, and then if you'd like to address a particular panelist, you can say so. That'll make my job easier, as I'll be pulling from the pool of questions to moderate the Q&A. So we'll get to just as many as we can. So first things first, it is my pleasure to introduce Dan Brisebois for our first presentation. Daniel Brisebois, co-author of Crop Planning for Organic Vegetable Growers, is past president of Canadian Organic Growers, a USC board member, and on the Eastern Canadian Organic Seed Grower Network's steering committee. Dan is also one of the 5 members of Tourne-Sol Cooperative Farm in Le Cèdre, Quebec. Tourne-Sol produces certified organic vegetables, flowers, seeds, seedlings, and herbal teas on 12 acres of land rented from an organic grain farm. Tourne-Sol's products are distributed through a 250-share CSA, farmers market, and online seed catalog. And you can follow Dan's blog, if you wish, at www.goingtoseed.wordpress.com. So, Dan, welcome back. Your presentation is up there, and you can go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Steph. So, hi, everybody. I'm going to talk about on-farm roguing, selection, and adaptation. I'm going to just start off with a couple slides about our farm, and then I'm going to go over some of the broad concepts and then a lot of examples of these broad concepts. A lot of the pictures I'm going to use are they're from our farm, but they're breeding projects that we're doing, not specific, so it might not be specific to everybody, but I'll make sure it is. And at the end, I have some key questions I've been asked to address, and I'll just make sure I touch base on those at the end. So, one sec. Okay. So I'm part of La Ferme Coopérative Tourne-Sol, Tourne-Sol Cooperative Farm, and Tourne-Sol is French for sunflower, and it's also a play on words for turning the soil. We're 5 farmers that farm together. We've been farming for 10 years. And in addition to the 5 of us, we also have 5 employees, so it's 10 people, our operation. We're, what's our farm? And though I'm going to talk about seed today, we do grow a lot of vegetables. About 75% of our sales is vegetables. About 3/4 of that is through a 350-member CSA basket program, and then the rest is through a farmer's market in the West Island of Montreal. We sell seeds through our online store and through a seed catalog. That's about 1/8 of our sales at this present, and another 1/8 is garlic. So that's who we are. And yeah, so I'm going to be talking about selection and roguing first off. So selection is the process of choosing what plants are going to contribute their genetic material to the next generation. And roguing is the process of eliminating the plants that we don't want to contribute material to the next generation. And this can be a conscious process, but it can also be an unconscious process. So just in the fact of growing something, there is selection pressures being exerted on it. And I don't know if somebody wants to mute.
Yeah, so for everyone on the phone line, not Dan, use your line.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay. So
I think somebody also needs to mute the speaker on the webinar computer.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's working well. Thanks, whoever did that. So selection is you choose what plants you want to contribute their genes to the next generation, is roguing what plants you don't want to contribute to the next generation. If you do not rogue, by default, any plants that go to flower will be contributing their genes to the next generation, and they might be contributing things that you don't want in the population. So that's why it's important to be continuously selecting. Here is these are purple top white globe turnips. We bought this seed for this variety 10 years ago when we first started farming, and we paid about $5 for a pound of seed. And we used it for a number of years. And one year we had some overwintered turnips that looked nice in the cold room in March, and I planted them out, and they gave seed. And then that fall we planted a row of our seed and a row of the original seed that we had bought. And we didn't really, we just did this to keep track of what was what. But when we harvested the seed, we saw that the seed that we had saved much more round, and the purple was more highlighted, a little bit more vivid, and the leaves had less disease pressure. And there was no intention in choosing the plants for seed. We had just chosen the roots that we liked best in the fall for harvest, and it was roots that had survived until the spring that I planted. And there was a marked difference between both seeds. This is especially easy to do in this case because when you buy seed for $5 a pound, there's not a lot of work that goes into maintaining it from the seed producer's part. They're just trying to grow as much seed as possible and selling it. Whereas if you're going to grow the same kind of seed for $50 or $60 a pound, then you're going to put a lot more work in it. And as a small-scale grower, it's important that we're trying to produce seed that's more in the $50 to $60 a pound range as opposed to the $5 a pound range. And that really comes down to, selection and maintaining good varieties. So in this case, we did, clean up a variety that I didn't think it was bad beforehand, but there was a marked improvement afterwards. But even in a variety like this is a Mizuna seed crop, a couple, 1,000 plants out there or so, and even in a case like this where the seed is pretty pure and things are pretty uniform, I will walk through the patch a couple times a week, and I'll eliminate anything that's vaguely off type or anything that looks diseased or not as vigorous as the other plants. And in a standard seed crop, I would probably eliminate 5 to 10% of the population, just sort of as maintenance. And I'll usually also highlight the individuals I like best and I'll save the seed from those plants separate as part of my stock seed for the next year. So kind of having two batches of seed, one that's definitely for sale or for on-farm, just general use, and then one batch of seed that's going to be my next seed for growing out seed. And so through the process of selection, we adapt varieties to our site. Anywhere that you grow seeds, the variety will adapt to the selection pressures that you put on it. This is a tunnel on our farm, probably in February, March. Outside weather is probably like minus 35 degrees Celsius during the night. If you go inside the tunnel under the row cover, even in the coldest nights, it doesn't go beneath minus 10 degrees Celsius under the row cover, which is a lot more tolerable for a lot of plants. And under there, and these guys don't look so hot, is a mix of different brassica rapa Asian greens. So these were planted in September. We got some salad greens cut off of them in November and December. In January, the cold killed back the leaves, and the roots still survived underneath. And then end of February, the roots the leaves start to grow back. And you can see this is kind of when it's looking rough, but in a few weeks, it starts to look better. And so with that intense cold, it kills back the plants that are really not cold hardy, and the ones that are less cold hardy don't thrive as well. And so I can select the better ones here, and the next and then they'll go to flower, they'll cross, and then the next generation will have varieties that are more adapted to overwintering. And in this case, I did start with different varieties that I let cross together to have more diversity in the population and more chance of having better genetics. But you could also start with just any variety and just grow a lot of plants and select those that do well, and over time there will be a gradual adaptation. So these same plants, a month later, snow starts to melt, and then it floods inside, and then there'll be waterlogged soil for a week or maybe even two, depending on the season. So there's another selection process that goes in towards making the crops, just a little bit more hardy and tough. So these are plants that have survived in those conditions, and then we'll go through and thin out to keep the ones that we like best, and and those will be the ones that are going to contribute their genes. So you got another picture here. And then in addition to, just this selection towards the environment, I can also choose for different, colors and leaf shapes and, whatever aesthetics that I like. And then I can also taste it. And so all those things can be selected for in the same type, in the same situation. If you do start from a cross, you're going to wind up with a lot more diversity. If you're starting all from one variety, the visual diversity won't be as pronounced as in this case. So this is a clear-cut case where there'll definitely be some adaptation to, like extreme adaptation to the site as this process is repeated year after year. So like many things when we're saving seed, it's important to be aware of some key biological traits. In the seed world, there's two big groups of plants. There's plants that are predominantly self-pollinating, called selfers, and plants that are predominantly cross-pollinating, called crossers. And with selfers, since they tend to self-pollinate themselves, there's not a lot of genetic diversity within the population, and it tends to stabilize fairly quickly as the genetics get more homogeneous. As such, you don't have to have as big populations to maintain a variety. You don't have to have as big isolation distances to avoid cross-pollination. And if you do put some selection pressure on your population, it's going to stabilize much more quickly than a crosser will. There are not a lot of crops that are selfers. Only a dozen or so domesticated plants that we generally use, including like tomatoes, beans, peas, lettuce, peppers, eggplants. And so these crops are very easy to start working with because the results are quicker, and the purity is easier to maintain once you hit it. Whereas crossers are have a lot of diversity. They're continuously exchanging genes. you need to have very large populations to be able to maintain the genetics. And so that's usually like 50 to 60, 70 plants at the least, but like 200, 300, 400 plants that you're saving seed from is even better. You need large isolation distances to keep them pure. In some cases, that might be as small as 600 or 700 feet, but often a couple kilometers is better. And because of all this gene flow between plants, if you don't do any work or much work maintaining your population, your variety is going to drift, and it's going to change to something else gradually or perhaps quickly, depending on what crops you're working with. And most crops are crossers, so you have to pay attention to those. So that's really important when working through your selection. The crossers need stronger selection. So selection happens continuously, and it happens right from the beginning. So in a greenhouse, we'll seed a couple seeds in a cell, and then once the true leaves come out, we'll eliminate the less vigorous plants. So already we're selecting for germination and vigor. When we're doing brassica greens, we'll often put as many as 5 seeds in a cell to just have a bigger selection. And then when we're planting out in the field, so like in the greenhouse, if it's seed crop, this is not for like a market garden crop, but for a seed crop, we will grow 30 to 50% extra plants of many varieties, and then we'll select the best plants going out into the field. So again, we're selecting for seedling vigor at this point. So this is this narrowed down to 1 cell per tray. This is a breeding project that we've been working on for 5 or 6 years, trying to select towards a red tatsoi. So at this point in the seedling tray, not only have we can select down to 1 cell per one seedling per tray, but also if we just want to have pink plants going out or purple plants going out, we can just select the ones that have that color and eliminate the green ones. So here, this is sort of the extreme case of selection. So this is each of the stakes that you see in this field correspond to a population of plants that comes from the seed of 1 plant I selected the previous year. So in, I guess, 2014, I would have selected 15 to 20 plants that I liked a lot, saved the seed individually, and then this year I'm growing 40 or 50 plants of each selection out. And then I can evaluate the population. So this parent seems to have fairly similar offspring. So I can evaluate, the population as a whole and the individual populations. And one moment, I'm just having. Okay, sorry, I'm just having a computer program problem here. Okay.
Do you want to flip through? Are you wanting to maybe Steph?
Can you make me the presenter again,
yeah.
Steph?
Oh, yeah, sure thing. Sorry about that, Dan.
There seemed to be a break in the connection for a moment.
Okay, that's great. I'm glad we didn't lose you altogether.
Okay. So yeah, so so some that look like this that are exactly what I'm looking for. This I like also, and then stuff like this, which is not what I'm looking for. And then so in the case, so selection isn't just destroying things. I can harvest those that I don't like, clean them, put elastic around them, and we can distribute them through the CSA basket. So so in this way that I can generate revenue off of the selected plants, in addition to any seed that's being grown out. So this example was, specifically a breeding project, but if it was a Mizuna or something else, it's the same thing, that I can harvest plants that I want. The ones I like less can be sold, and just maintain those. And then even after the vegetative state of the plant, once it goes to flower, starts producing buds and florets, you can select for the shape and size of the stem and the floret. Is it something that's big and thick, or is it really bushy and small? And the flower structure. And then if you harvest the seed from individual plants, you can also select for the potential yield that each plant giving. And if you're selecting for individual high-yielding plants, high seed-yielding plants, over time your variety will produce more seed and then generate more revenue that way too. So this is without looking at flavor or taste or shape or any of that stuff. You can select for traits that make it a better plant that grows well and also a better plant that produces seed well. So we'll also mark plants that are particularly early or plants that are a little bit smaller or bigger. We'll mark them with some way that we'll be able to keep track of it in the field. This is marked with a piece of paper on it, but since it's in a tunnel, it's not going to get rain on it, so it won't disintegrate. Whereas if it was in the field, we couldn't use the same technique. Here is some picture of a Chinese cabbage that we were doing a variety trial on, and you can see, so this was near the end of October, early November. We've had some hard frosts, and you can see some of them in the back have almost turned into jelly. But there's a few plants that look a lot better than the others. So in this case, we're selecting. You can see selecting those will tend towards a better population. So harvest them with the roots, and then if you cut it in the middle, you can kind of see what a good plant and what a bad plant looks like. On the right is what I'd really love to see. On the left isn't as hot. Though it's better than nothing, but it's though if you do this to your plant, you probably can't save the seed because you've damaged the growing point. So here we're trying to evaluate the insides of the Chinese cabbages without damaging them. And at a certain point, we just started chopping high enough and looking at the inside to see which plants that we like that will be grown out the next year. Here are these are Treviso radicchios. So again, it's a late planting, selecting the ones that are more frost resistant. And we actually did this a couple weeks ago, and some of them had really nice red heads. This is exactly what I was looking for. Some were a little bit more green, not quite what I was looking for, and some weren't heading up at all, which is what I don't want. And I only had 100 plants or so to select from, and I wanted to have at least 20 or 5 or 30 for the next generation. So if it had a nice head, independent of the color, if the shape was there, I selected it. But stuff that was open like this, even though I liked the color, this I eliminated from the population. And then it's a bit out of focus, but I chopped these again to keep the bottom part. And I was able to kind of look inside and see sort of what the inside looks like. And you can also eat this. Not created for sale at this point, but definitely can be eaten through the winter. And so we'll overwinter. This is an Italian dandelion, but its roots kind of like the ones before that will planted in Rubbermaids, overwintered in the cold rooms through the winter, and then the next year dug up, see what looks best, and then plant out for a seed crop. So in this case, we're selecting for those that store best. And it's really important if you're dealing with roots to dig them up and to look at them. So this is radishes, turnips, carrots, beets, anything that's a root crop, you have to dig up and look at and see if it has, how uniform it is, the traits it has. If you just leave things in the ground and they go to seed, you don't know what you're getting. So this is a black radish, winter radish, overwintered in the cold room in a bag. So in the spring we can see which ones look best. If anything have rot spots like this, we won't plant those out. This is a cross that we had done between a few different radishes we're selecting out. So we want to see what it looks like inside. So we nicked the edges of the plant. And so if you nick the side of a beet or a radish, you can see what it looks like, but it'll dry up, and you'll be able to plant it, and it won't, and it should be able to produce seeds. So we're able to, look at the inside. This is a group that had, black skin, purple rinds, and white inside. So we were keeping those, mixing them together out of the ones that overwintered. We had a few different groups that we got after the nicking, and we planted them in different parts of the farm so that they wouldn't cross up. When we're dealing with like sweet peppers or hot peppers, we'll wait until the whole plant is heavy with fruit. The fruit, it's fairly uniform, the whole plant, and then we'll pull all the plants. And this way we'll be able to evaluate approximately what the yield is, or fruit yield on a plant. Really heavy plants are much more interesting than really skinny plants. So this is some Georgian flame hot peppers that we had purchased from a commercial seed source, or got from a commercial seed source. And each fruit is from a different plant, and you can see that there's a lot of diversity in that. So if there's a shape that I like better than others, and I grow enough plants, I'll choose the plants that have a similar shape that I like, and I'll save the seed just from those. In some cases, I'll save the seed from each plant separately, especially if they're very distinct one from the other. But if they're close enough, I'd rather just bulk many plants together to have broader genetics in there. And then, I might mark on some of the fruit this is from a breeding project, which is why there's different numbers on it. But I'll mark some of the stuff, and then I'll bring it into the house. And so this is a hot pepper that we were dealing with called our carrot bomb. So when I'm cooking with it, I can evaluate how spicy it is, how sweet, whether the flavor is. And if I have a few different selections, I can choose the ones I'd like best. You can kind of look at the wall thickness also at the same time. And then, with squash, same thing, looking for different fruit shapes and then looking for storage. One thing that's different with squash than many other crops is that by the time that you see there's an off-type coming from your squash or a zucchini or a cucumber, if you eliminate those off-type plants, any fruit that's still in the field on the plants you've left has had a chance of being contaminated with that off-type plant. So if you really want to do a good roguing, it would mean eliminating your off-types and the plants you don't like, and then cutting all the fruit off of the remaining plants to let them set a new batch of fruit. Alternatively, you could self-pollinate each plant and save the seed separately and have more chance of purity in that case. With squash also, you can be selecting for the size of the seed cavity. Do you want a bigger seed cavity to have more seeds so you can sell more seed, or do you want a smaller seed cavity to have more flesh, for more eating material? And then the same thing, if you bring them inside and you're cooking them one by one, you can taste the ones that are sweetest or driest or whatever trait you like and select for that. So that's kind of an all-around approach to, a bunch of different slides on selection. I have a few questions that I was specifically asked to address. So I'm just going to tackle them one by one. So the shortest path or strategy to farm-adapted varieties is grow what seed that you want to use. If you don't grow varieties you don't care about, grow what you want to use, grow a lot of plants, and you select the best. And that, if it's really having a lot of plants that you grow and selecting the ones you like, is how things will adapt to your farm. Pay attention to any off-types that show up. So an off-type is something that have crossed up in a previous generation. So often we're trying to get rid of off-types, but sometimes you might find that one of the off-types does a lot better than your than the variety that it's contaminating, or that it's sweeter or it looks nicer. So these seeds here, there's already been a cross done. You don't have to worry about about crossing it. These are like little are gifts that were being given. So paying attention to them and saving the seed from those can start a new farm-adapted variety pretty well. How do we maintain seed integrity in the context of seed saving? So really, to maintain seed integrity, of course, just isolation distance is one of the first things that you should respect. The second thing is growing a lot of plants so that you can choose the best ones to maintain or improve the population. That's really there's no shortcut around that. Really, that's the best way to do it. And then bulking up versus selection, when to do the latter. So I'm guessing in this context, bulking up just means growing seed and not doing a lot of selection and just growing more of it. I think as small seed growers, we should always be selecting. Varieties can drift and they will drift. And sometimes small-scale seed or local seed has a bad reputation. And I think that we really need to be selecting and offering the best stuff there is out there. And that's how we can make the case that local seed is good. And selecting it continuously is what is going to be doing that. Paying attention to stuff when you're growing it out. We're not just growing commodity crops that are sold at really cheap prices. We want to grow stuff that's adapted to our areas, and that's going to really make a difference on people's farms. So the risks with allowing genetic diversity versus loss of distinction. Generally, we want as broad genetics in our plant population so that we can adapt to changing environment. And this can be heat, drought, cold, waterlogged conditions, disease and pest pressure. But we also want a certain uniformity in flavor, color, shape of whatever we're eating, growth habit. So again, we have start with a big population and choose what you like. Choose the stuff that's good, and you should know what traits you want uniform and what traits you don't. So if I have a zucchini plant, I might want them to all be yellow zucchinis or all green zucchinis, but I might not care if it's a serrated leaf or if it's a whole leaf. So I might really select for if the plant is doing well, independent of the leaf, I will choose it if it has the right fruit traits. However, I probably don't want to have some bush plants and some vining plants in the same population because it might be a mess to deal with. So know what you're looking for in terms of that uniformity. And this is not a specific to selection question, but I was also asked to talk a little bit about small-scale commercial viability of seeds. And so like any other type of farming, profitability comes with technical skills, experience, good planning, and management. So this makes or breaks any farming operation, and seed is not different. And so you can sell seed bulk to other seed companies. You can sell seed as packets to gardeners and farmers. There's also other, in-between models, but those are kind of two extremes, the bulk or the packets. Selling seed as bulk generally compares pretty well to direct marketed fresh vegetables in the sort of $20,000 to $40,000 an acre range, and harvesting and processing time is often well above $100 an hour. So, bulk seed easily compares to growing vegetables. If you put that bulk seed into small packets and sell it for $350 a packet, it can be a lot more lucrative. $100,000 to $200,000 an acre. So, if you had a quarter acre in seed, you might be able to grow, let's say, $6,000 or $7,000 of bulk seed. But if you pack this up into small packets, it might be worth $35,000. So the bulk seed itself is profitable as an operation, if you know what you're doing. The $35,000 for the same amount of seed might sound fantastic, but you have to sell, 10 to 15,000 packets to do this. You need a web store or you need seed racks. You have to have branding. It's really creating a full-time job. So it's not something you just piggyback on another farm operation to make some extra money unless you want to put a lot of work into it. And it means that more than just having to have good growing skills, you also have to be a good marketer and good business manager. So that's kind of the range of small-scale commercial viability. But I would say it can be very viable, and there's many examples of people doing it fantastically. So with that, I'll say thanks for following me so far.
Wow, awesome. Thank you so much. Dan, in that presentation addressed quite a lot of questions that were sort of pre-submitted for the People's Choice webinar. So thank you very much. I did issue a bit of an invitation there for folks to write in questions for Dan about selection, roguing, and on-farm adaptation. Where nothing has come in yet, I'm going to keep that invitation open, and I'm also going to move us on to our seed panel. And this way we can just kind of keep things moving while people's fingertips warm up. So each person on our seed panel has been integrally involved in past webinars, and together they represent really diverse experience and skill sets in seed, including vegetable seed and field crop, seed movement issues, and they come from regions and communities all across the country. So I'm happy to introduce them now. This is Dan Brisebois. We've just heard from Dan, and I'm happy to say that he's going to stick around and be part of the seed panel. Our second panelist is Michelle Smith. Michelle, do you want to unmute and introduce yourself?
Take my finger off the mute. You can see here that I farm in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and for those who don't know the geography, that means my island sticks way out into the middle of the North Atlantic. So I have a very variable and challenging climate, which means that I've learned to work with open pollinated varieties to get a crop off at all here. So I've had a lot of experience in that.
Awesome, thank you. Our third panelist is Jane Rabinowicz.
Hi there. Very happy to be here.
Great, short and sweet. Next we have Martin Entz. Martin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, I just lost my connection, so anyways, you can hear me. Yeah, I'm Martin Entz. I'm at the University of Manitoba out here in Manitoba. It's wonderful to be on the panel, and I really enjoyed Dan's 30-minute lecture. It was fantastic.
Awesome. And so do you have a visual right now, Martin, or just audio?
I'm going to, I sort of lost my visual, but
okay.
We'll carry on. Just keep...
Okay, yep, no problem.
I'm good.
Okay. And then finally, our last panelist this evening is Patrick Steiner. Patrick, do we have you?
Yes, I am here. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, so welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for coming and being part of this. I'm going to start with a tiny little disclaimer, which is that it was completely impossible to address every question that we received over the course of the last few months. So I want to call your attention to some resources which address a lot of the questions that came in that either have been dealt with in past Bauta webinars, so questions about, for example, the best way to store seeds, or questions that were really, really broad in terms of, for example, what's the easiest seed to save. We could kind of talk for a long time about that, or we could just refer you to some materials that might kind of help your research on that. So the first reference material is this book, How to Save Your Own Seeds by Seeds of Diversity Canada. It's available at seeds.ca. Seeds of Diversity Canada also put together a bibliography called Seed Production and Banking. It's available on our website, seedsecurity.ca. That's a screenshot there, and it's the third item down on the resources page. It's a really thorough, wonderful reference document. And then the third thing I'll point to is a manual called Small Scale Organic Seed Production. It was written by Patrick Steiner. It may be available on the Farm Folk, City Folk webpage. It's definitely available at stellarseeds.com. So please feel free to look up those references and keep on learning beyond what we're offering in this webinar. So great. So our first People's Choice question is going to go to Michelle Smith, and we've put it at the top of the list because it dovetails really nicely with Dan's excellent presentation on selection and adaptation. The question, Michelle, is how to breed for crop vigor in a timely manner given climate chaos.
Well, this is where the open pollinated varieties, their larger range of gene expression under different climate conditions really comes in handy. I mean, I have actually two farms here in Cape Breton, one on the coast and one inland, and certain varieties will exhibit markedly different phenotypes, even just with a couple of degrees difference. So that's important, that you got to be in it for the long haul. And a lot of what I wanted to say really, really does stem from what Dan says, but you have to have more attention paid to managing your weather-related risks and hardiness and stuff like that. And what he said about crossers and selfers usually holds true, but you have to remember even selfers, if you've got, if you use a lot of intercropping or if you've got really diverse habitat, there's going to be a lot more crossing than conventional academic literature will let you understand, because the pollinators, wild pollinators, are very active in these situations. There's some studies from Peru in the 1940s where even peas, which are highly self-fertile, had 60% evidence of crossing, which is really high. And there's longer times for crossers like cucurbits, but the literature says that you kind of need 9 or 10 generations to see significant changes. But you don't have to sort of take out all the plants that might have possibly shared pollen with the ones you've rogued out, but it's going to take a little longer. But there you go. The first thing that he emphasized I want to talk about as well, you really have to use a large grow-out population. For our dry beans, for example, we use 2,000 plus, kind of 300 row feet as a minimum. We do sell a lot of dry beans for table stock, and the cucurbits need about 300 plus plants. So this isn't a problem for serious market gardeners, but it's really not feasible on a home scale. You gotta kind of, you can't fudge those numbers. You gotta have numbers to be able to do this. I also want to, Dan didn't emphasize this too much, but you really have to make sure you use non-invasive ecological techniques to reduce but not eliminate environmental pressures. So you've got wide row spacing, no row covers in humid situations, interplanting in wild habitat reserves, because if you kind of suppress disease and pest pressures and environmental pressures, you're not going to get a clear understanding of what genetics are being expressed in your population. I'd also suggest that you kind of focus on maybe 2, most 3 traits besides hardiness to concentrate on, just because it's easier to keep track of how much progress you're making that way, especially when you're just learning to work your variety. So choose disease resistance and productivity, not that, and taste and shape as well. Choose a couple. Don't try and do too much, in one go. And when you're selecting hard, even under these variable conditions, you got to remember to balance the need to keep the population numbers high while selecting the best specimens. In a pinch, like a bad season, I'll select the very best, then I'll make up the rest of the numbers as best I can. And that way the extra good ones still contribute proportionately more to the next generation. And even if something is really ugly from disease or whatever, if it's still producing viable seed in a really rotten year, keep them, because it's still, keep the least ugly looking ones, and that's going to translate down the road to more resistance as you go through the process. I'd also say keep good records, and not least so you can see if you actually are making progress with your work on that. And when we talk about stories from the field later, I might, illustrate with some of the experiments I've been doing with anthracnose resistance in beans and productivity and stuff like that. It's great because you can see significant results in 3 or 4 generations with selfers, and only 9 or 10 generations with crossers, and that's hugely reduced from kind of developing a new hybrid to adapted conditions. That's why I'm so enamored of population selection techniques. So that's a very Reader's Digest version for this one, Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for those kind of add-on thoughts to Dan's presentation. That's great. So what we've kind of done from here is we've grouped questions into what we've received that are crop-specific. So in the crop-specific category, we've got a question for Patrick Steiner, which is, how do you know when it's time to harvest broccoli seed?
And I will address that one. Is that right?
Yep, that would be great.
Okay. So one of the things I like about this question, and it's whenever I talk about seed saving, I try and make a point of saying that if you learn to think of crops as being part of the larger crop family, and you learn to save seed from one of those crops, it gives you a lot of experience, a lot of clues as to how to save all of the crops within that crop family. So for example, here the question is how to know when it's time to harvest broccoli seed. And the nice thing about that is everything you learn about when it's time to harvest broccoli seed is also applicable to most of the rest of the brassica family that it's a part of. So it's sort of the same skills, the same timing, the same kind of harvest and threshing and cleaning techniques for broccoli as it is for cabbage. Well, I mean, broccoli is an annual, but for many of the other, in the same way, once they've made pods, for your kales, your mustards, your tatsois, your cabbage, Brussels sprouts, they're all more or less the same. So when I give the answer to this, it's also the answer to that whole cabbage family, the brassicas. So what I do, basically, once the broccoli has started actually forming shoots and pods. It'll all be green and very fleshy when it's doing that. It'll have grown to twice its normal height, possibly, with the long stems full of pods. And really, observation of that plant over a couple of weeks is going to be, that's what I say is the best way to know when it's time to harvest. Keep observing that plant, and it'll start off with green, fleshy pods. You'll notice that they won't be very full, but you'll notice them starting to swell. You'll eventually be able to actually see seeds swelling and forming in there. And I always recommend actually opening up some of the pods to watch this development over the course of a couple of weeks. You'll first start by seeing little green seeds in there. With the progression of a bit of time, a couple of days, couple of weeks, those pods, those stems begin to dry down eventually, and you'll see a color change. So they'll move closer to, they'll start yellowing. Instead of it being green, they'll start getting a yellow color to them. And if you open up the pods, you will notice that the seeds inside are also starting to change color. They're starting to move towards a light brown color or even a dark brown color. And when the crop is really mature and ready to harvest, the seed stems and the seed pods have become kind of a papery brown color. And they're actually, and another great way of seeing that is touch. You can touch the pods. You'll feel the crinkly crunchiness of them. And in fact, many times the pods will then shatter in your hands when you touch them. If you start seeing that kind of shattering, that's a good sign that the seeds are ready. But not all seeds on the plant will have reached the same maturity stage at the exact same time. So rather than just pulling the plant and starting to thresh those pods and seeds that are ready, what I do is I pull my broccoli plants or any of the brassicas when they're at that papery brown stage. And at that point, if you're opening up the seed pods, the seeds should be a dark brown, even a black color. That's kind of what you're looking for to know when it's time, as well as the touching it and noticing it's dry. But I windrow all of my brassica plants, which just means to lay them on the ground kind of in long rows, and you can pile them up, 3 or 4 or 5, stack up the plants high. And what I do is I also try to face them towards the sun, face them southwards with all those pods facing that way. And I'll leave them in those windrows for another week. And this is assuming that it's kind of dry weather and favorable to the drying of the crop. And the reason I do that is there's still energy from the plant. I've pulled it up with its roots intact and everything. There's still energy that's actually feeding those seeds and maturing those seeds that might have been a little bit behind the rest of the seeds in the plant. So it gives me a greater overall uniformity of dryness and ripeness in the seeds. And then once I've had them windrowed for a week or so, then I will come and I will start threshing the seeds and then cleaning the seeds. And again, that kind of post-harvest handling, once you're cleaning the seeds, makes a big difference too, because you're going to do your enough seed cleaning to get rid of slightly immature seed, which will often be lighter, or cracked seed, things like that. So I hope that answered the question enough. If there's any written explanation, any other written questions, you can write them in and I can explain further.
Okay, great. Our next question is for Martin Entz, and it's, does stem rust in oats affect seed health?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. So the image in front of you is one of some oat leaves, which I'll be getting to in a moment. But let me just say a few words about stem rust in oats. Rust is it's a fungal disease, and in oats it's important to recognize there are 2 different types of rust. The question was about stem rust, which obviously occurs on the stems, and the other one is crown rust, which is on the leaves, which is really what you're looking at on the screen there. They are two different animals. Stem rust is very devastating because when the fungus gets a hold of the stem, it'll drill into the stem and drink from the sap of the plant and really devastate the yield potential. So many of you will know that these rust populations, they don't overwinter in Canada typically. They will overwinter if there are barberry or certain buckthorn plants growing in your neighborhood. But many places in Canada, there have been active programs to eradicate those plants. That's not true everywhere. So the bulk of the rust originates in the southern part of the United States, and that's where the rust spends its winter. It's a snowbird, and then it starts moving up. And what happens is the oat crops are infected. The ones growing in, let's say, southeastern USA, they'll get infected, and then once they're infected, in 7 to 10 days, those plants will produce new spores, and spores will move with the wind. And there's a lot of prevailing south winds in the spring, and so the spores move north. And they will arrive. There are actually websites that will tell you where the spores are. It's kind of like, you know, Santa Claus at Christmas. You can phone NORAD and find out where Santa Claus is and tell the little kids. But USDA and Agriculture Canada both monitor spores, and there are various websites that you can monitor where they are, how intense they are. They're just really guides. They don't monitor everywhere. So that's a bit on the biology. What you can do about it in terms of management. Early planting is really important to try to avoid exposure to the spores as much as possible, so that if you plant your crop early, hopefully the spores are not moving north that quickly that year, and so they will arrive later in the season and not devastate your crop as badly. The second control method, which is a really important one, and it's probably the most important one, and that is to select a resistant variety. There is good genetic resistance for stem rust in oats. There's also good genetic resistance for crown rust or the leaf rust in oats. And the picture that you see on the screen, you'll see some of the plants are quite devastated with the spores growing on them, with very orange spores. And then you have plants where there's white dots, like the second one from the left has white dots. That is an example of a resistant plant. It's going to give a little, it will have been attacked by the spore, but it's not showing a big symptom. And that's a really important strategy, is to use resistant varieties. This particular question we know came from Ontario, and there is, for Ontario farmers, there's a website called gocereals.ca, and you can check out the varieties resistant. So for example, in recommendations to Ontario oat growers, there are varieties like AAC Bullet and AAC Oakland. Those are both Ag Canada varieties. They are categorized as resistant to stem rust. And there's other varieties like, not to pick on any, but Riley. It's a little bit susceptible, and that website you can compare all the varieties that are available. And every province has this type of, or every region has this type of information available. So it's very important in organic production to select resistant varieties. At the University of Manitoba, on our organic farm, one of the first years that we were growing oats, we grew an oat that was not crown rust resistant, and it devastated the crop, and very important. Crop rotation as a final sort of management tool is also can be useful. It's not as important as resistant varieties for the purposes of stem rust resistance, although it's important for many other things. But it's really important to know that oat stem rust, is different than wheat stem rust. And so if you have wheat that's got stem rust, it doesn't mean your oats are going to be affected. Oat rust, stem rust, is similar to the stem rust that affects wild oats, and that affects meadow fescue, which is a perennial forage grass. So wild oat, meadow fescue, and tame oats, which we grow for milling oat or horse oats or whatever, feed oats, they all suffer from the same rust species. So if you're growing oats and you have a stem rust concern, maybe grow it away from where there's meadow fescue and try to control the wild oats. So that's what I have on stem rust. Thanks for listening.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Martin. So we're going to move on to the next question. I want to say I like what's happening here in terms of follow-up questions for each panelist. If you type them in, then a panelist doesn't typically do 2 questions in a row, so they can kind of write back and forth, and we can have a couple of conversations at the same time. So that's a very clever use of the chat pod, and thanks to you guys for doing that. I'm super impressed by the thoroughness of the answers that you guys are giving. We'll go on to a question for Michelle, which came in, which is simply, other than rotating soil/plot, what strategies can replace tissue culture for disease reduction in potatoes? Michelle?
Well, Cape Bretoners really love their potatoes. So in terms of low-tech ways of cleaning potato stock, I'm going to go back to their traditional methods. Because these older guys have probably never bought certified seed, and they're penny-pinching Scottish lies. For one, they very often can't get the really starchy varieties they like as certified seeds. So their rule of thumb is only to use the very smallest ones for seed. They're called the chats here. The smaller the better, provided they'll keep without dehydrating too much over the winter. And it makes sense because potatoes are virus accumulators, and small ones haven't had as much time to virus accumulate. And their second rule is that when they feel a variety is getting run down, it's maybe getting scabby or kind of ugly looking, they will harvest their seed stock while the plant is still green and healthy looking. So the potatoes need careful handling this way because the skin is so tender, but it really is worth it. And I've used these tricks on a couple of varieties that I was given, in a sort of a seed exchange that were pretty ugly. And after 3 to 4 years, they were much more respectable looking. They maybe don't have the refinement and totally clean culture of a tissue lab process, but it really works well enough for home use or sort of market garden use. And obviously, good rotations, clean cultivations, very important in that. So was that quick?
Awesome. Thank you. You want advice about potatoes? Ask a Cape Bretoner.
Oh, yeah.
Another crop-specific question is going to Dan. What is the best way to clean lettuce and other small seeds?
So when you're, and this is almost all dry seed, I use these process, but it's really, there's 3 steps. There's extracting the seed, there's screening the seed, and there's winnowing the seed. And often screening and winnowing happen back and forth. So when you're extracting the seed off of the plant, it's really important that you do it when the plant is very dry. If it's not dry, seed won't shatter until it came off the plant. So in the case of lettuce, I'll put gloves on my hands, and I'll rub the seed heads to get the lettuce seed off. If it's something that can shatter, I might put it in a bin and or on a tarp and stomp on it to shatter it. Next, I would collect all the material in a bin, and then I'll screen it with screens that we made out of hardware cloth. So we'll run it through a 1/2-inch screen, and then a 1/4-inch screen, and then an 1/18-inch screen. So each time the seed and smaller bits will go through the screen, and the big parts down on top, and we just toss that aside. And once we've gotten it through the smallest screen that it'll fit through, we'll usually winnow it. And so winnowing is we have a box fan, or 2 box fans side one after the other, and we'll pour the seed in front of the fan and just blow out the chaff and dirt. And people are often really afraid of this step, but if you're afraid of losing your seed in the wind, just put a tarp down, and then you can put a couple bins in front of your fans so that the heaviest seed will fall in the bin closest to the fan, and the dirtier, the dirt and other stuff will fall a bit further. But winnowing gets so much stuff out of it. It's really, and it doesn't have to be, it's just a $15 box fan can do the job. And then once I've winnowed once, I'll usually screen another time, either with like an 1/8 of an inch screen, or we have a collection of different spaghetti colanders, and I have one that's a nice size for lettuce, and so I would use that to kind of do a final screening. You can buy commercial seed screens, and that really does a great job, but often you can do a good job without that. Yeah, and one other tool that can be made is an air column, and there's different plans online to make them at home, and with that, you could just run you probably would want to screen it a little bit to take most of the chaff out, but once you have the dirty seed at the end, you could just run it through the air column, and that'll blow out the dust and chaff and leave your clean seed at the end. Yeah, so that's, there we are.
Awesome. That's great. Okay, so that's it for the crop-specific questions for now. So we kind of gathered a few questions, which I loosely call just stories from the field. It's kind of the potpourri section of the questions that we received. So the first one is for Jane, and it's how do we educate people on the importance of seed diversity in an engaging way?
Yes, great. So the image here that's being shown underneath that question is one of the ways that we're trying to do exactly this at USC Canada. So I'll go through some of the kind of things the tricks of the trade or whatever that we've kind of come upon that we think are pretty useful. Specifically at USC Canada, we're dealing with folks who are not already saving seed. So for them it really is, why is seed important and why is biodiversity important? And so here are some things that for us have worked really well. First of all is kind of giving people this notion that seeds grow food, and that the vast majority of our food, the food that we eat every day, actually comes from seed. So that may sound very basic, but it's actually far from the consciousness of a lot of people. So just making that connection between seed and food can be very powerful. And then getting people to think about seed producers. So this idea that seed producers supply food producers with the things that we need for our food supply, and this is amazingly important for our food security. So just to get people to appreciate the link between seed and food and the role of seed producers in stewarding our food supply. And then introducing people to the amazing diversity of seed out there, and specifically the intraspecific diversity. So the amazing diversity of shapes and colors and textures, names, history, links to culture and lineage that exist across different species, across different crops, but also within different crops as well. And we find using visuals as much as possible. So again, there are some examples on the screen here to get people exposed to the amazing abundance and diversity and beauty of seed. And then to get people thinking about the food that we eat. So what are the things that you look for in your food? We look for flavor, nutrition, and links to what feels comfortable, connections to our culture. And then to kind of say, well, actually that's not what breeding, what plant breeding is about these days, modern plant breeding. It's much more about suitability for widespread industrial production, so transportation, uniformity, really a good fit for the industrial food system that drives us. And that in Canada, the vast majority of the vegetable seed that's grown in the country is imported. And then on organic farms, when we're talking about grains, most organic farmers really don't have access to a lot of organic seed, and they're actually planting conventional seed at their farm, which doesn't grow as well under organic management. So that actually we're not breeding for the things that we look for in our food, and we're not breeding for the things that consumers are increasingly looking for in terms of sustainability. But we can breed for these things. We can produce seed and food that do fit organic farming systems, and increasingly what both farmers and consumers are looking for. And we can breed for place-specific things as well. So Michelle's talking about Cape Breton, and I mean, we have an amazing diversity of place across the country, and farmers need varieties that work well for their production system and work well for their environment. And we can breed and select for these things, and that's what Dan and Michelle and others are speaking about today. And I wanted to talk about the power of stories. So again, just, I'm not a seed grower. When I hear seed growers talk about what they're doing on their farm and the amazing work that goes into it and the amazing results that they get, and then I see the pictures, when you hear stories of immigration and people carrying seed from one country to the next, and Mojave says the story goes with the seed, I think that's incredibly powerful. And I love that. And also stories of what happens when we don't have diversity. So thinking about the Irish potato famine and examples of crop failures and catastrophes that come from an over-reliance on a given variety. So the last thing I want to mention is just breaking through to new audiences and the importance of moving beyond the already converted, and reinforcing with folks that there's ways to get involved with the seed movement other than growing seed. So thinking about eating diversity, if you're a gardener, buying local organic seed, donating to groups like USC Canada and other groups that are involved, and Seeds of Diversity groups that are involved in biodiversity conservation, and just this notion that anyone can be a seed saver. So we've got these pins saying I'm a seed saver. They're for seed growers, but really for anyone who is supportive of a strong, biodiverse, resilient seed system.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Our next question was submitted by a number of different people in a number of different regions. So actually we're going to get a couple of perspectives on it, and we're going to start with Dan Brisebois. The question is, what are some primary seed considerations for mixed farms?
So mixed farms can mean different things to different people, but it's basically seed and something else, livestock, cereal, vegetables. What is important when you're adding seeds to a farm is to know what is profitable on your farm. If seed is a new thing that you're doing, you got to recognize that it's a new business venture, and you have to start small. Grow 10 or 20 bed feet of something, 30, 40 plants. Don't only grow a couple varieties, or maybe harvest seed from peppers or tomatoes that you're already growing from market. So basically start small, evaluate the profitability of the venture, and if it's profitable, develop it in function of the profitability. So if it seems like growing seed isn't very profitable, don't expand right away. Figure out how to fine-tune your systems before you do it. If seed is making money on your farm, it will pay for itself down the line. And making money could be that you're selling it, but it can also be that you're saving money by not buying seed. But staying small and figuring out how to do better as you go along is I think really, really important. And once you know what you're doing, then get bigger. Specifically for vegetable growers, I think it's worth separating your seed crops from your vegetable crops. Seed crops have different irrigation needs than vegetable crops. Once a seed crop starts to go to flower and set seed, it does not want any kind of overhead irrigation on it. Seed crops last a lot longer in your field. So if you had a broccoli crop and a broccoli seed crop, it's going to be in there for a month or 2 months longer. So having long-lasting seed crops can disrupt your cover cropping cycle or incorporating the whole block. And last off, seed crops will shatter, and some of them will self-seed in your garden, and that will become a weed problem in the next year. And that can be a real challenge when you're dealing with carrots or beets or that kind of thing seeded the next year. So I think it's worth separating your vegetable crops from your seed crops. And again, I just repeat, I'd say start with things that you like, start small, and let your system evolve as opposed to having too high ambitions and just jump in and going crazy. That's my answer.
Awesome. That's terrific. Michelle, given what Dan has said, do you have anything to add from your perspective working on a mixed farm?
Well, I'd especially, emphasize starting small, and when you're sort of choosing, I'd recommend, concentrating on varieties that are of particular benefit for your situation. So here in Cape Breton, I concentrate on varieties of warm season annuals that I try and select and adapt to our challenging season here, like beans, tomatoes, and all the cucurbits, partly because they have a high market value here since they're so difficult to grow, And by developing my kind of stable of unique and adapted varieties, it gives me a significant revenue advantage in the market. Now, I've had to work on market development in the past to, convince people to try these unique things, but not anymore. That work is done. But, if your thing is brassicas or greens and that's what turns your crank, then you really need to concentrate on that. And again, spread your effort outwards after starting small, only as it makes logistical and economic sense for your farm. Do a little, do it well, take on too much, and you're likely to be overworked and frustrated and pretty poor results as well.
Okay, great. One question that came in is, what are seed libraries trying to accomplish? And I'm going to put this one out to Jane.
Yes. Okay, so 4 keywords I would say for me around seed libraries are security, access, adaptation, and education. Seed libraries are so important in conserving biodiversity and keeping it accessible for now and for the future. So we discussed earlier how important genetic diversity is for our food supply. And when it comes to seed libraries and seed banking, I want to talk about how it's important to conserve the genetic diversity in traits that may not be useful right now but could be useful later. So we don't know, plants and seeds, they have so many traits and mysteries about, qualities that, resistance to pest, disease, adaptation to local growing conditions, etc., that maybe we don't think are useful right now, but they could be really interesting as conditions change, especially in light of climate change. And so we've talked about, the current situation. Mainstream agriculture focuses on large-scale production of a few major crops and a pretty low diversity of those crops. And so, we can't understate the importance of seed libraries and banks in maintaining the diversity that we need for our food supply. I wanted to talk a little bit about a spectrum of security and access when it comes to seed banking. So a lot of people, when we talk about seed banking, they think about the Svalbard seed vault or the Doomsday seed vault in Norway. And so that would be an example of a highly secure and pretty low access gene bank. And then you can think about, and Steph has the images here of seed libraries in public libraries where we're on the other end of the spectrum, we've got very, very high access, lower security, and less quality control. And then there's lots of different examples in between. So you can think about our national gene bank in Saskatoon as more like the Svalbard seed vault, but a little bit less secure, a little bit more accessible. You can think about, we've helped set up a regional seed bank at Dalhousie University that's about regionally adapted seed for Atlantic Canada. That's, on the other end of things, high quality, pretty accessible, and also pretty secure. So we need everything along that spectrum of security and access, and we need those institutions to be interacting with each other. We also need links between in situ and ex situ conservation. So we need to be conserving biodiversity in farmers' fields, in backyard gardens. We need to be adapting varieties to changing conditions. We need to be renewing seed banks as well, so growing them out on site, so that's the in situ conservation, and then saving seed and sending them to seed libraries and seed banks, that's the ex situ or off-site conservation as well, to keep them secure and accessible for the future. So we really need both in situ and ex situ conservation, and we need those conservation efforts to be engaging with each other. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is what we're seeing increasingly is a really important role of seed libraries around educating the public on the importance of genetic diversity, the importance of keeping that diversity accessible to the public, how to save seed, where to source seed, et cetera, et cetera. So these really are, we can think of them as libraries and kind of static beings. Are actually highly dynamic, really important for biodiversity conservation and for access and education as well.
Awesome. You guys are doing an amazing job communicating an immense amount of information in a short time. Thank you very much.
All of our hearts are beating very fast, I think.
I had a lot of coffee today.
So our next topic of questions is plant breeding and seed quality. Before we go to that, there is one question in the chat pod that hasn't been addressed yet. And as we are running a bit long on time, I do want to make sure that we get it. So it was addressed to Dan. And Dan, the question comes from Mel, and it is overwintering in cold room. What's best? Peat, sand, plastic bags? What's the ideal humidity/temperature? Probably that would take a long time to answer, but maybe like some pros and cons about overwintering in a cold room. If you could address that.
Well, if you have a cold room, so I'll talk about our situation. We have a cold room that has a compressor and an evaporator, and it's set up to store vegetables for the winter. I think this is a good baseline. So if you're already set up this way, it's easy to overwinter stuff. So for carrots or beets or turnips or like winter radishes, I would, put those in a plastic bag, like a 40-pound plastic bag. They're probably perforated. I don't know what frequency, but it's perforated bags. So there's some air exchange, and I would put it in the cold room. And when you're harvesting your roots, you got to make sure you leave a little bit of the green on the top. You can't cut into the growth point. It can be worth checking a couple times through the season to see that everything is doing okay. But I find some varieties just are bomb-proof no matter what. In the case of some varieties that might be a little bit more picky, you might, in that case, or if it's a biennial like chard or Chinese cabbage or some chicory or escarole, in that case, you might be able to overwinter them in the field, but we have to overwinter them indoors. We'll dig them up, and I'll put them in a Rubbermaid bin with, we just use the potting soil mix that we have in our greenhouse because it's what I have available. And I kind of dampen it a bit, but not too soaking. I don't want to be soaked in it because usually a lot of these bins don't drain. And put a lid on it and put it in the cold room and let it go. Mainly, I don't want things to dry out too much, but I also don't want things to be sitting in water. So it's a little bit of a broad answer. One other thing that we'll do for overwintering, and this is not using a cold room, is I'll put things in a bag, and then I'll dig a hole a couple feet deep, and I'll put the bag in the ground, and then I'll bury it. And then the next spring, I can dig it back up and take stuff out. And, being a little bit underground, it really moderates the temperature. Something that might not survive our winters here survives quite well there. And the reason I put it in a bag is just so I can find stuff. I don't want to bury a bunch of roots and then have to be digging around looking for them. I hope that's adequate.
Great. Thank you for the question, Mel. Thank you for the answer, Dan. So we'll move on to plant breeding and seed quality questions. We have just a few left. This first one is for Martin. How do you breed for disease resistance in grains?
Okay, thanks. Well, Dan gave us a very good overview of how they do selection for cold tolerance in brassicas, and breeding for disease resistance is similar in that you subject your broad genetic material to the disease stress. It's really quite straightforward that way. And then you select the survivors from that and advance them beyond, you select and increase those. Plant breeders get a little more sophisticated in terms of a couple of things. First of all, they always want to start with a broad genetic base, and sometimes grain farmers say, well, I have this old variety and I'm just going to grow it over and over again and select it for disease resistance. Sometimes that works, but often it doesn't. You need to have new resistance genes expressed, and the best way to do that is to make a new cross and create that diversity. And that's actually what we're doing in the Farmer Participatory Plant Breeding Program that the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security is supporting. So farmers or breeders use broad genetic diversity, and then what breeders do is they sometimes really ensure that the disease pressure is very high, and they will spray spores of whatever, stem rust in oats or fusarium for wheat, to really put a strong selection pressure on those populations. And then they, the final thing in terms of sophistication is they might use some kind of molecular marker tools to detect whether those resistance genes are actually within what appear to be the survivors. So they use the word, they look actually at the genotype, not at the phenotype, which is just how it looks or whether it got infected or not. So that's in a nutshell what they do. One of the important things for organic production is that environment. I just want to spend just a few seconds on that. In the organic system, where if you manage your organic land well, you'll have a diverse soil biology, and it's really important that the selection happens in that soil biology, because the soil biology means things like fungi and bacteria that sometimes that are the same sort of class as some of the pests that we're trying to get around, and so they compete with each other, and so that organic selection environment is important. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. On to the next. This question is for Patrick. What if the seed supplier farm has different management practices than the grower farm? Patrick?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm a good example of this because I not only grow seed that I market myself, but I also market seed from other farmers. And so I do kind of need to know a little bit about it. And mostly I have conversations with my seed suppliers, and they're mostly people that I actually know personally too. So I have some understanding of their practices. But what it comes down to is, and by seed supplier farm, I'm assuming we're talking about like that's a seed company that's then supplying seeds to other people, and the grower farm is that contracted seed grower that's maybe supplying seeds to the seed company. That's how I'm looking at this question. And the way I see it is that as the seed supplier farm, as the seed company myself, I have to have quality standards and clear communication about what I expect to be done to the seeds that I am then going to sell. Basically, I need to communicate that to the grower that I'm contracting out with. So I need to tell them that I expect to see isolation distances that are in line with what you might read in some of these, publications, Seed to Seed, or the Seeds of Diversity one, or John Navasio's Organic Seed Grower. Like you got to tell them what you're expecting for isolation distances. You got to tell them that you're hoping that they're going to do some roguing and pulling out off types, that kind of thing. You're going to talk to them about that kind of thing. You're going to also maybe check in with them once or twice in the season if you're on top of it, and make sure that they're doing fine. Most importantly, you're going to tell them if they have any questions about what they're doing to please call you and just ask for advice, see if you've got some feedback you can give them. But basically, if a grower is not doing what I think needs to be done, I shouldn't be selling their seeds. I won't be selling their seeds. I can tell them, that's just not enough isolation distance for me to feel comfortable selling that seed. If you want to do it next year with this much, then I'll sell it, or something like that. That would be the kind of thing that I would do. So I think, and there are contracts that you can write up. I have had written contracts with my farms for years. It's slid a little. I've gone to kind of more verbal contracts with them. But those are the kinds of places in a contract, whether it's written or verbal, where you can explain what you want as the seed company, and where then the grower knows what's expected. They know when they have to have the seed to you. Usually they have a seed sample to you by a certain date that they can visually inspect and then do germination test on. And if all is good, then they have to have the entire lot to you by a certain date. Those are the kinds of things I might have in some of the contracts I've written. Yeah, I think that answers it. It's mostly just that the seed company needs to have a quality standard they're looking for and convey that information to the grower.
Yep, that's super, super helpful. Thank you. Let me just see where we are here. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is our last pre-submitted question, and it is also being thrown out to Patrick. Can you share or recommend some seed quality tests? Patrick, you may be on mute.
I'm sorry. I keep pressing *6 back and forth.
That's okay. We got you now.
So yeah, germination test is the first benchmark of quality for the seeds. Once you've got them in your hands, you got to know if they're going to grow. And most of us with small-scale seed companies and many farmers just at their homes do an in-house germination test to tell you what germination percentage you have. You want to, create a chamber or have a room at a certain temperature that is going to be warm enough for those seeds to germinate well. And you can do a small amount of seeds, like 25 or 50 seeds, and then multiply it by whatever you need to get a percentage. To get an even more realistic idea of what your germination percentage is, use a larger number, like 400 seeds. It helps reduce statistical differences and gives you a truer picture of what your germination rate is. Another seed quality test that probably people don't do this specific test at their homes, but that might be a laboratory test, is a purity analysis, which essentially just measures the amount of foreign matter, dirt, chaff, or weed seed, or even just other crop seed that's in your seed lot. For example, I never do a purity test, but I do a visual inspection of all of my own seed and any seed that is sold to me by other farmers. If it's not clean enough, then I have the equipment here that I do my own cleaning on those lots, and it's not uncommon for me to clean a lot further here because I want it to be a little bit cleaner of chaff or minor dust or something like that. So a purity analysis of some sort is another quality thing. And the reason that that's important is if it's not gotten as clean as possible, things like chaff and dirt and little dirt and other particles in there can actually carry disease. Other types of weeds might be noxious, or other types of seeds might be noxious weed seeds or weed seeds that you're then selling to people. And of course, any kind of matter in there could cause problems to people using things like precision seeders. So you really want to get your seed lot as clean as possible. Another kind of test is disease testing. Again, from my experience, I don't do any disease testing here at my own home, but I have sent seed lots away for testing. And what I say about that is generally the grower knows if there's a chance of a disease problem. So having clear communication with your grower, or you yourself as the grower, observing your seed crop as it's growing, tells you a lot about if you're going to have a disease problem on the seed. And if you really suspect heavily that you might have one, there are laboratories that you can send things to. And since this is a national call, I don't really know where people's closest ones are. But here in BC, I've sent stuff as far as Saskatchewan. That was where I found a good laboratory. It was called BDS Laboratories. And I found them by doing a search online. And I've also sent seed to a lab in California. But there might be things further out east that I'm not aware of that people can access. And, they can be expensive, some of them, up to $100. Some can be less, like $25 or $50. So you kind of got to decide whether it's worth it. And you usually have to tell them what disease you're looking for, what you suspect you have, and then they run a test looking for that. The fourth test I'd talk about is vigor testing, which goes hand in hand with germination testing. And it's a good one to try and develop some benchmarks for vigor testing at your home, which there's different ways of doing vigor testing, but probably the simplest way that you can do at home is to keep notes on the timing, how fast your seed is germinating. So you're not just, when you're doing a germination test, going, I ended up with 82%, but you might check the germination after 6 days and say, I had 60%, check it after 10 days, realize you're up to 75%. After 2 weeks, all of a sudden you're at 80%. And it kind of gives you an idea of that 60% of your seeds actually germinated in the first 6 days. Those are your most vigorous seeds. And that's actually what people want when they're buying seed. They want a lot that'll have kind of uniform emergence, the ability to send down a taproot quickly and establish itself, because your germination tests are in generally ideal conditions. It's not the same as field conditions. A vigor test gives you a better idea of how that seed will perform in adverse weather conditions, colder soil, real field type conditions. And the reason a vigor test could be helpful to you too is then you could go back and clean your seed lot a little bit more to end up with a better uniform seed lot with higher germination and closer germination all within a certain time frame. And that's particularly important if you're selling carryover seed that's a year or 2 years old. You want to go back and maybe have some benchmarks to know, hey, in this lettuce seed, I want it to germinate at 6 to 8 days, not at 14 days or something like that. And if it is germinating a lot of it in the 14-day range, go back and clean that seed again, and it'll give you a better seed lot to sell, whether you're the farmer selling it to a seed company or whether you're the seed company selling it to the end user. That's where a vigor test can be really helpful. I know Dan and Michelle had a few comments, especially on disease testing.
I was going to say I haven't really used these, but there are strip tests you can do for diseases, like I think for tomato mosaic virus and a few others. And I think you kind of crush up the seed and then you can test them, and it gives you a yes or no, kind of like a pH type test. And yeah, so that was just my comment.
And I just wanted to say that if disease is a concern for some reason, there are some seed-borne diseases that you can reduce or eliminate through the hot water processing. Now, you have to do it carefully. Google the technique. Otherwise, you'll really reduce your germ. But as well, Seeds of Diversity has been working on a method for treating the seeds with UV light, and that has a lot of promise. We're even talking about putting a patent on it so that it can remain in public domain. And the advantage of that is that the UV light does not, in fact, seem to reduce germination and still eliminates a lot of those seed-borne diseases. So there's certainly things you can do if disease does become a concern. Obviously, the best thing is not to have disease, but if you're not sure or if you've had a certain amount of environmental pressure, you might want to investigate those two methods.
Okay, this is kind of our slotted end time. We obviously didn't get to kind of the live questions in quite the way that I expected, although I have to say I'm super impressed by how interactive the webinar has been in terms of people using the chat pod. So I don't think that very many questions came in that panelists weren't able to address that way. I think in the interest of time, I always do try to end the webinars on time to respect that people have other things to do. So I would really invite everyone who's participating today to send any feedback on today's webinar to me. My email address is seed, S-E-E-D, @acornorganic.org. Thank you very much for joining us, and I want to just thank from the bottom of my heart Dan, Michelle, Jane, Martin, and Patrick. You guys did an incredible job. And it's quite obvious that had we had more time, you could have spoken at length. And so thanks so much for doing the work that you did to participate. We will be designing our 2016 webinar series soon. So go to the website and look for updates. And otherwise, we'll reach out and let you know what's coming next. So thanks very much, panelists.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having us.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, take care, everybody. Talk to you next time.